Well, I am delighted to say that joining me today on the Godcast is Callum Skinner. Now, Callum is an expert cyclist. He's a Formula track cyclist who has won a silver medal at the Olympics, and he's also won a gold medal at the Olympics before issues struck, which we'll talk about shortly. And in 2018, he decided to walk away from the sport in a competitive sense. So, Callum, a very warm welcome to the Godcast. How are you today?
Hello. Yeah, no, I'm fantastic. Thank you very much for having me. It's always a real pleasure when I get invited onto podcasts that aren't solely about sport. I feel like I've got a bit more to offer. So thank you for having me.
Yeah. Whereabouts in the world do we find you today?
You find me in Manchester. So I've lived down here since I was 17. So the way the squad works is when you get to 17, you've basically got the choice between uni, work, or you can be lucky enough to get a contract, and it means you have to move down to Manchester to fulfill that. So I'm actually quite slowly kind of becoming quite in love with the city and the north in general. It's got a real kind of grit to it, and it's such a contrast between such a historical, beautiful but stationary city like Edinburgh.
Yeah.
Manchester is there's tons of people running around, there's tons of activity, the skyline's changing. And it's a very tough city, but it's in some ways that's quite similar to Glasgow in a little bit, which we might get into later. But yeah, I love it down here.
So when you came down, were you living near the track arena? Were you in that area around the Etihad, that kind of part of Manchester?
No, they put us possibly in the worst area to put track cyclists or like young athletes anyway. They put us in Fallowfield, which is probably home to the biggest student population in the UK. So as much as we were all trying to behave as much as possible, there was temptation absolutely everywhere.
I'm sure, yeah. And is that still the case? You still, have you stayed around Fallowfield? Have you gone out to the posh end?
No, I don't feel like you can live in Fallowfield once you're over 24. I think once you've done that, everyone moves to Didsbury, and then slowly, once you get a family, you move out to Cheshire, and that's how it works. I think in this bit of time.
Is that the goal?
Well, it's not a conscious goal.
So let's just go back to Scotland. So you lived in Glasgow and Edinburgh. Is that right?
Yeah, so depending which local paper is writing about me at the time, that tends to dictate which hometown is mine. But yeah, no, I lived in Glasgow till I was about 12. I was going to call it part-time, but that's probably the best term. But my folks split up when I was 6, and my dad lived in Glasgow until I was 12, and Mum moved to Edinburgh.
Yeah. Was Edinburgh a cool place to live as a young lad? I mean, my brother went to uni there, and I've got friends there, and I've visited generally as a tourist. But what was it like as a young kid? Was it a decent city to live in?
I think so. I think one of the best things that happened to me at that age was going to the school that I went to, which was James Gillespie's, and for a state school, it was quite unusual. I mean, it got criticised for having too affluent a catchment area, which was quite obvious at 1 or 2 points. But they've done more to kind of diversify it a little bit. But there was no uniform. The teacher was very much a friend instead of a person of authority, and they really kind of encouraged you to come out of your own skin. And as a kid who had gay parents as well, because my dad subsequently came out and married my stepdad. It was a wonderful place to feel totally at ease with that, because there were other kids in the school who had same-sex parents in similar situation.
So how old were you? Would you have been, Callum, when your dad got married to a bloke?
I'd say, I can't actually remember off the top of my head. Probably about 13 when he got married. I think they had to get a civil partnership first because it wasn't allowed at that stage.
Yeah.
But to me, my dad's always been openly gay. So I did this piece with the Gay Times where we examined the whole issue as like a family, and it brought out some like amazing stories, because I never actually knew a story of him coming out to me as a 6-year-old, and it turns out it was really quite heartwarming and quite indicative of the kind of goodness that most human beings have in them before they're corrupted by any kind of ideology. Because he said to me, "Oh, just to let you know, son, at 6 I'm gay," and I was like, "Cool, what's for dinner?" It's like it's no issue at all.
Mm.
And it led to a lot of thought about how do we end up from, you know, that childhood acceptance all the way up to, you know, where some people end up, where they end up homophobic, and, you know,
Mm.
most people end up, you know, perfectly accepting. It's such an interesting ideal about
Yeah.
where that comes in.
Did you ever get any tough times from having a gay dad as a young lad? With teenagers can be quite cruel, can't they? Did you feel the rough end of people's tongues sometimes?
Like genuinely not at all, which makes me really recognize
Right.
how lucky I was to be in that environment.
Yeah.
Um, you know, I'd say I was probably quite careful who I told, but that might have been a reaction of how shy I was naturally. Weirdly, when I became an athlete and moved to Manchester full time, I regressed massively. I wouldn't tell anyone because there's a real association with sport of like toxic masculinity, and all that kind of stuff. And there was a few little statements that my new teammate said that put me off. My
Right.
brother had a bit of a tougher time. I think he started to kind of surround his identity by the fact that he had a gay dad, because it was something that was different and interesting that most people wanted to know about, opposed to his identity being surrounded by the fact that, you know, he's a great guy, he's really loyal, he's really friendly. So he had a bit of a tougher time, but I was okay.
I'm quite surprised by what you've just said there about this notion of you know, the tougher masculinity in sport. I get it, but you're not that old, Callum, are you? This is not. We're not talking a long time ago here, and maybe in my mind I'm thinking, blimey, I thought we'd moved on a bit quicker than that. But so you just chose not to talk about it. Is that how it played out then?
I remember when I was when I first moved down and we were kind of getting to know each other, because they put the entire squad into this block of flats, and if you're not sharing with someone, you're a neighbour of someone. And it's probably like similar to a lot of people starting university or something. And I remember, you know, we were sharing our backgrounds a little bit, and I said, somehow we got into the topic that my parents weren't married when they had me. And then they said to me, "Oh, so you're actually like a real life bastard?" And I was like, "Yeah, but I didn't think we're in the 18th century, so I didn't think that was really too important." But it was just a little off the cuff comment that basically just put me straight inside my shell. And the way that the system operates when you're an athlete is that you kind of have to be good before you can put your head above the parapet. It's very much a kind of meritocracy. It's like
Mm.
you don't really have a position of power until you've won something. And I was probably one of the slowest guys to ever get taken on the team, so I was winding my neck in and keeping my head low, not wanting to upset anyone.
Callum, in hindsight, do you regret that? Not
Yeah,
talking.
massively. Well, no, I I guess I'm a little bit disappointed myself. I wish I'd had the confidence to not let it affect me. But I guess you can't change how you reacted at the time, and it's a shame, because I think the more I hid it, the bigger an issue
Mm.
it became to myself. And by the time that I did actually become open about my family, everyone was perfectly accepting, or disinterested, which
Yeah.
is the two answers that you want. But no, I do struggle with that a little bit, because, you know, to be perfectly honest, my interaction with my dad probably reduced as a result of that. You know, I wasn't inviting him to competitions. It was my mum, you know,
Mm.
partly because she's more sporty, and my brother takes after my dad. That's more into like drinking and dancing and stuff like that. But yeah,
Have you subsequently had that conversation with your dad about that situation? You know, have you felt? Well, I think you touched on maybe an element of guilt about, you know, kind of putting it away to one side.
I feel like we went through a process around the Olympic Games of coming to terms with it that was quite cathartic for everyone, and I feel like a lot of the work that I do surrounding the topic now is in a way kind of, you know, paying back a lot of the guilt that I feel about that time. But no, the way that it eventually came up was that both my dads are really quite understanding that, or probably actually more aware than I am that sometimes sport isn't a very nice place if you're LGBT, because they're far older than me, and they never ever engaged in sport because it was just not seen as a thing where they could be themselves. So in a way, maybe they actually kind of endorsed that ideology that I should just keep it quiet. Like, they never said to keep it quiet, but they didn't ever say, like, you know, why aren't you being open about your family? Why aren't you inviting me to events? So I think it was kind of like a unsaid agreement, I guess. But I remember there was this proper heart-wrenching moment where before the Olympic Games, there's a system that the team runs where they get in touch with all of your family members and basically offer them support. And that's quite useful, because when I won my medal, my granny got doorstepped by quite a few tabloid journalists. She hadn't had the training, so she invited them in for tea and coffee. But my dad said to me, like, I don't mind hiding the gay thing, and it still kind of cuts me up now, because the last thing I want him to do is to hide who he really is and not be himself. And I realized that I was part of that. So I remember, like, instinctively on the call, kind of just immediately said, like, no, you don't have to hide it, just be yourself. And then I kind of vowed, you know, win, lose or draw, I'd go out public about my family situation, you know, and to hell with the reaction, I guess.
Do you know what, Callum? You know, I know you've said before we did the interview that you're not a particularly religious guy, but I can see some real parallels between your kind of story with your father and some of the gay colleagues that I have who work in the church. And there's this kind of, you know, kind of, you can be gay, but, you know, don't really talk about it, or, you know, keep it all very private. So there's a distinct parallel there, which is quite interesting. I just, no pun intended in the cycling world, but I jumped the gun a little bit, because I do want to go back and talk about your time at school, and I want to start by asking you a question before we get to your situation regarding dyslexia. Were you academic at school?
In a verbal sense, yes. Like, I know most kids, when it came to, like, because in English you always have to do like a speaking section, and most kids will like go white as a sheet and just have total dread at the thought of that. But I always really enjoyed those elements because it's somewhere where I could excel. And if anything, my ability to verbally communicate and have good vocabulary was actually getting me into more issues, because there is, well, when I was at school, there still seemed to be a bit of an antiquated view of dyslexia, because they just thought I was being lazy. Because they're like, obviously he's intelligent, he's sharp, he can speak, and he's just not applying himself when it comes to written work. Like, maybe he's just a bit of an attention seeker. And there was some really properly kind of, I guess, like, damaging moments actually, where I did start to kind of convince myself that I was stupid and had nothing to offer. I remember when it came to, you know, fractions, we did this thing where we go down to class, and if you didn't get the answer, like, you know, you start all over again until you get back down to class. And for me, that was my situation where I go white as a sheet, because it's like that I just couldn't do it, and it wasn't through lack of trying. I think, like, my sporting accolades show how persistent I can be with something. And I remember the teacher's solution at the time was to put me out of the class with the smartest kid, and we weren't allowed back in the class until I could do fractions. So we were in this kind of like semi-traumatic situation where this kid was really stressed because he was scared of the teacher. He knew how to do fractions, couldn't understand how I could do it, and I was really stressed out because, you know, that he'd been put in a horrible situation. But my mum, I guess maybe like most mums, but she was really insistent that this wasn't an issue of intelligence. And I remember probably getting a bit heated occasionally at some parents' nights and stuff like that, where, you know, maybe where a teacher might say something like laziness or something like that, and I guess that just didn't add up to what she was saying. So, you know, eventually I got tested, and when I got that result back in that I was, you know, somewhere in the middle of extreme to moderately dyslexic, I started getting the support, and at that time, sport came into my life as well. So I was finally good at something that didn't involve writing anything down, and that's when I turned from this kid who was like, painfully shy. Like I was one of these kids that wore a beanie hat so that no one would look at me, and wore headphones all the time so no one would speak to me. Like I just wanted nothing to do with anyone. I was really inside myself, and through sport, through that diagnosis, I started to get my confidence back.
Just tell people what dyslexia does to you as an individual in a class of other people who don't have dyslexia. What impact did that have on you, Callum?
I think that it's difficult for me to say because I don't really know what it's like not to have it. But my physio described it quite well, where then she always felt like she was being texted by a different person. So whenever I would text her, it'd be littered with mistakes. The grammar would be all over the shop, and it might even just say something that doesn't make any sense at all. And then when I'm in person, I can hold a conversation like any other normal person. So it's almost like that split personality between your written work and your spoken work. But it's especially when you're undiagnosed, it's not a nice place. And if my mum hadn't been as formidable as she was, I could have easily slipped through the cracks. And an alternative to starting with British cycling down in Manchester was I had a university place, and that was definitely not in the cards before I was diagnosed.
Callum, it's so interesting talking to you, because one of the reasons I wanted you to come on was because of dyslexia, and maybe I'm going to reveal something to my congregation here, but it's only in the last 12 months that I've done dyslexia tests on, for myself, and some of the things you've said are just incredible, because I was a bit of a chatterbox at school, and I remember my dad trying to get me to do fractions, and it was just an unmitigated disaster. It didn't matter how many times he went through it with me in the slowest detail. And at the time, and nobody ever picked up on it when I was a boy. And it was a friend who actually said to me, he said, I think you might have dyslexia. Go and do the tests and things. And that has been incredibly revealing to me as a guy in his early 50s. But so how did your teachers react to dyslexia? Were these educators trained for somebody like yourself, or did they kind of bumble their way through it?
I think it was a bit of a mixture. I'd say what I lacked in written and mental maths application, I had an ambition massively, so I'd always try and find workarounds. And we got given these, they weren't laptops, they were kind of like laptop calculators, which would spell check it for you and stuff like that, and would always different coping strategies, like doing my homework a little bit early, coming back to it the next day. And then by that point, even I can't recognize what I was on about, but I recognize enough of it to try and correct it properly. Because and then there was probably other little bits, like your handwriting gets terrible, and it's a classic dyslexic trait because you're trying to hide your mistakes because you're embarrassed about it. That's why most dyslexics have bad handwriting, which possibly ends up making most doctors dyslexic, I guess. But no, it just kept trying to find workarounds. I remember there was one or two things that jarred with me a little bit. One was we were given a dyslexic card, which I found really quite funny, because it was to hand to your teacher if you were getting a tough time, to basically say, this isn't my fault and this is what dyslexia is. So it wasn't just a figurative dyslexic card, they actually gave us a physical dyslexic card, which I was like, I've got no issue telling a teacher what I'm struggling with here. So no, it's I wouldn't say I left school with everything being resolved. I think by the time I was left that support structure and I didn't get extra time in exams or scribe, I think that it took maybe 4 or 5 years after leaving school where I'd confidently be able to put up a post on or a blog or something. But even yesterday, I uploaded an article on Twitter and misspelled the headline. It was pretty embarrassing. It still kind of cuts me up a little bit, but it's getting there.
It's really interesting. As I said, it's so interesting because it does cut you up, and I don't think people realise. I mean, I have to write sermons in my job. I've got this looks like an extensive range of books that I've got here. Most of them are my wife's, and the ones that are mine are ones that I've had to read because of the studying I've done. But I can promise you, I've not read any of these books in their entirety. I just can't. I've got one here,
Yeah.
Johnny Marr book, which I managed bits of, but I really struggle reading in that context. And I don't know if it manifests in the same way as you, Callum. I prefer to listen to things, so stuff like doing this is much better than reading a book about somebody. I just prefer the one-to-one and the audio side of things. So we should move on because this is going far too quickly. But and so you became good at cycling. So was this just, how did this happen? Was this playing out with the kids on the street, or was it an intention to somebody saying, no, we're going to make this guy a top sportsman?
Yeah, I guess it kind of started just kind of racing kids on the street on my bike, and kind of thought, I love speed, which has got me into trouble in different countries before. But I really love just going fast, and that pursuit of continually going fast is what really hooked me to it. And not to labor on the dyslexic point, but being dyslexic was actually quite a big advantage in being an athlete. Our sport is the most measurable sport in the world. Like, we're talking about 50 different metrics that measure stuff on the bike 1,000 times a second. And it can be death by numbers, but I can't even remember my PBs on anything, pretty much. And it gave me a real appreciation for like how it actually felt. Far more subjective. It would be really impossible to describe to someone down the phone like how an effort went or something like that. But as much as my teammates sometimes got too hung up about numbers, I was kind of free of them to an extent in a sport that was really heavily based on numbers. But fundamentally, I really just got into cycling because I love the venue. I love the kind of theatre of the venue. It's a 45-degree banking. If you don't go fast enough, you'll slip down. It's one of these sports that would never be invented today because it'd be seen as too dangerous. And I just bought into it. And there was an incredible community there as well. And cycling can be seen as quite expensive, but if you find a really good cycling club, there really isn't any barriers. Like, you can beg, borrow, and steal pretty much anything you need to get to a semi-decent level. And then finally, I guess because I'm asthmatic as well, being a sprint cyclist specifically really suited me, because a typical session, you'll probably only ride your bike 4 times. And in those 4 times, you'll go as fast as you can for 10 seconds. And then you'll spend the rest of the time sitting around for half an hour chatting with your mates. Or in my case, trying to get rid of my wheeze.
Yeah.
And then you can go again and see how fast you can go next time. There's a whole bunch of little elements that really gripped me.
Yeah, and I guess with Chris Hoy being from Scotland as well, was he kind of a big influence for you? Was he somebody to aspire to?
Yeah, for sure. I remember him when I was younger just being like a really accessible hero, and that was something that I'd never found in different club sport. I was really into I kind of had a choice between rugby or cycling. But I never had the Scottish rugby team kind of pop down and say hi on the pitch. But Chris Hoy came down maybe like 2-3 times,
Right.
and as a kid, that was so inspirational that I kind of just got hooked. And Scotland at that time was a country that wasn't good at many sports, and all of a sudden you got the best guy at the sport who's Scottish coming down to this pokey little track in Edinburgh. It just felt like someone cared and someone was invested, and that was probably a decent hook as well.
So when does it go from being you're just a fast kid on a bike to being this guy has got some serious potential? Can you remember that point and what it was?
Yeah, and I think to align to my self-confidence at the time, I don't say I was ever really comfortable with saying I'm good at something. I'm still not especially good at it now, but when I won the British Championships as a junior, that's when I kind of started to feel semi-comfortable with saying it. And then from there, you're essentially in the arms of the British cycling system, so you don't have to worry about any costs. You're just kind of, the only limit is your own potential, really.
Yeah. And you talk about those fine lines, those minute seconds. And in a previous world, I was a retail manager for Superpower Argos, and I don't know if you've ever done these, talking of freelance, in these conference events, and quite often our conferences would have some remarkable sports people. Sir Clive Woodward spoke. Lizzie Yarnolds came and spoke to us, and I remember Adrian Morehouse came to speak to us, who was the Olympic swimmer, and he talked just as you did about the fine margins. I can't remember the exact story, but I think he lost the gold medal or a major event by the minutest of seconds, and then he won the gold medal by the minutest of seconds. What's it like, Callum, living in that world where you are? To me, if I get up at 7:05 instead of 7 o'clock, it's not going to change my world. But if you're not feeling absolutely on it on a day, that can be the difference between success and failure in sport terms. So how do you cope by living in that world all the time?
It can be a really pressurized environment, especially when you first move down, because the way the system works is it's like a big pyramid, and they take on tons of kids at the beginning, and it slowly narrows to the Olympic champions at the top. And on the way, there's people getting chucked out. And sometimes you're talking about kids that don't have any backup as well. So the pressure is huge, and you're also socializing and living with them in this brand new city. And you're being compared against one another multiple times a day with multiple metrics. But I'd say that was probably going back to that advantage of dyslexia. I was kind of liberated of that a little bit. If I actually wanted to compare myself to someone, I had to look up their PB, look up my PB, and see if I could compare it appropriately. But one thing I would say on numbers is there's often like a misconception when you get to the Olympic Games that, in the lead up to the Games, people would say, oh, you must be training hard. The Olympic Games is coming up. And I'd kind of be like, it's not just like a kind of 6-month target. The way it worked in our system was it was more or less like a 10-year target. Even when you're like, probably 14 years old, they're kind of saying like, we're only taking you on because we think you can win a medal at Rio de Janeiro. And I remember, the pressure just kept building, because there's such a history and the legacy within the team. Every time someone turns on British cycling on the TV, they expect them to win. But that wasn't the case with us. We had odds of 22-1 to win the Olympic Games, because we finished at the World Championships in 6th place before that. And my team was comprised of 2 other guys, and they were both reigning Olympic champions in that event. And I was taking over from Chris Hoy. And it was pretty evident continually that it was my fault that we were struggling to qualify and that we were on 22-1, because these guys individually were breaking world records by themselves. It was me that was letting the side down. So there's a huge amount of pressure, and basically all that 10 years of strife and work ended up landing on a 44-second event with a winning margin of less than 1/10 of a second. And just looking back, like the slightest of mistakes, we're talking about, moving a couple of inches further up the track, so you're traveling further around, or, not keeping your elbows in, so you're not as aerodynamic, would have cost it. And it kind of scares me a little bit actually to look back and see how close the margins are sometimes.
Callum, how dispensable were you then? So if you weren't getting those numbers, you were gone. Is that the fact? Is that the fact of it?
Yes, it can be it's kind of an ongoing point of interest that I have within the system, that athletes are quite often seen as dispensable, or just seen as physical assets. And I don't think that's right. I guess the mantra they always led by was, as long as you're always showing continuous improvement, at least year on year, you're probably safe.
And in that bubble, again, excuse the pun of the COVID, but in that bubble of elite sport, is everything taken care of in terms of fitness? So I suppose where I'm going here is, have you got a good psychiatrist looking after your mental health? Was mental health in the package, I suppose, is the question I'm asking.
It was, but only in a performance context. And I think that was one of the major things that tripped me up. I was fine at performing under pressure, otherwise I wouldn't have got anywhere near the level I did. What I wasn't helped with, especially, was my mental health issues that were starting to creep in. Everything is tailored to performance. Even kind of like sports medicine, it's all about kind of treating you as quickly as possible to get you back on the bike as quickly as possible. It's a different kind of medicine. They don't take your kind of long-term health into account. It's about getting you back on that bike. And the athlete wants to get back on that bike so they can stay in the team.
Yeah. It's definitely a theme. I've interviewed quite a number of sportsmen now, and there was you may or may not know a guy called Andy Payton, who is an ex-Burnley footballer. I'm a big Burnley fan, but he played for Celtic as well. Scored a lot of goals in for Burnley, and when his career was up, that was it. He was gone, and nobody gave a fig about him from clubs that moved him on. I find it quite extraordinary, actually, that elite sport can do what you've just said. You will focus how you are mentally tuned into getting the best time, but not actually going to ask you how your weekend's been and how your parents are. And maybe that's where maybe the pastoral side of me as a priest is coming in there. But I find that really quite disheartening. And is that still the case, would you say?
I'd say on the whole, it's a medals first program. And I think to an extent some of that toughness needs to be there. It is cutthroat, it's just the nature of the business. But on another hand, there's plenty of compassion and thought that could be there that isn't. And I was very lucky to have some very compassionate coaches and doctors around me. And when I was at my worst, they started saying, like, we don't care about Callum Skinner the athlete, we care about Callum Skinner the bloke and the person. And I actually kind of really do fear for some athletes who find a very different situation to that, because it is seen as life or death when you're in that situation. It's very easy to get caught up in that little environment because you don't know anything else. I never had any other friends outside of Manchester. Home was far away, and if you're not careful, that whole environment can consume you.
Yeah, and as just to kind of bring this little bit to a conclusion, was there, as you were in that squad in preparation for Olympics, was there any discussions between the team and you about what happened after cycling, or was that kind of that's your world, Callum? Once we've done with you, that's your world, and you go and sort your career out? Which of the two was it?
No, I'd say the help is there to an extent. We have performance lifestyle advisors, which are probably closest to kind of careers advice at school. But I'd say sometimes the kind of brutality of the system limits your engagement with those individuals, because it's not so much anymore. Like, I think the way the sport's heading now is a balanced athlete is a good and sustainable athlete. But the way it was in the past a little bit was, if you're going someone to speak about what you're going to do after sport, are people going to question your commitment to the cause right now? Are you admitting defeat in yourself right now? So there's very much a kind of emphasis on being seen to do the right thing. And sometimes, like performance lifestyle, not to be harsh about it, and I feel like I can say this because I did media studies, but it's kind of seen as the media studies of topics in school. You know what I mean? It's the one that people don't necessarily take that seriously and can always be superseded by a classic topic, for example.
Yeah. Callum, I want to ask you this question. I mean, you should probably get lots of stereotypical questions, but I suppose I want to phrase it a little bit differently. What did winning an Olympic gold medal do to you?
I'd say I remember when not long after I won, I ended up going to dinner with one of my first coaches, and he was fantastic. He was a child psychologist, so he was really switched on. And he said to me, I said to him, like, I'm not actually as happy as I think I should be given the situation. Like, this is all I've ever wanted, and I've exceeded it. And he said, you're probably going through a bit of a mourning period, because this goal has totally encapsulated your entire life for the last 10 years. And now it's gone. Your only goal as a person, as a human, was to win Olympic gold. And that's gone now. So I can understand why you're feeling a bit empty inside. And I'd say from there, it cascaded into far worse and, possibly, well, definitely more kind of dangerous situations where there was a lot of issues that I'd completely neglected as a child and a young adult, that I'd use that goal of the Olympics to completely ignore it, because that distraction was so massive. You could dismiss anything because of the Olympics. I remember, like, one of my best mates asked me to be the best man at his wedding, and I said, "No, mate, I've got the under-23 European Championships on." And And that was, you know, in a societal sense, that would be outrageous. It's like, why would you miss your best mate's wedding where you're the best man because of your job? But in cycling, it was almost like you didn't have to offer an excuse. It was seen as part and parcel of the cause. And that goes back to what I was saying earlier about it being life and death. It was seen as that important, and you didn't feel as if you had to explain yourself for actions like that.
Gosh. And so you kind of, a few years after the Olympics, the career is effectively over. Was that something you were aware of the minute pretty much the Olympics were finished, or did you just kind of hit a brick wall at some point and think, I can't carry on in this situation?
No, I thought I'd carry on a little bit. You know, I'm pretty probably stubborn when I set my mind to something, and I kind of just thought, you know, if I keep going, maybe I'll get that distraction back. Maybe winning a second gold medal would be as enticing as it was winning the first one. But it just didn't really come to fruition. And I remember looking around my teammates and thinking, I used to have that kind of enthusiasm. I used to be that driven. And it's not that I'm not, but I'm just like 98% up on the spectrum there, 100% committed. And then I started to realize that wasn't enough. Like, I was starting to get slower, and it became all the more hard to deal with because people expected gold medal winning performances, and before they didn't. You know, we were 22-1, they didn't care. But now it was like Callum Skinner Olympic champion, where everyone kind of shouts and stuff like that, and then all of a sudden you're spat out at the back of the race. It became more and more unenjoyable, and there was a lot of toxic thoughts and voices starting to come into my head, and even, you know, bits that I was holding on to about, you know, I could always say I could perform under pressure. I started to have, you know, kind of low end panic attacks / breakdowns at competitions. So it was this horrible reality that I was faced with, where I realized that I got into cycling because it was a distraction from all these issues, and now this distraction was trapping me more than ever.
Callum, I mean, I don't want to pry if you don't want to go there, but people watching this are going to say, well, what were the issues? Is it something you've openly talked about, or is it something that you still, yeah, if you're happy to say?
No, absolutely. I remember it was just a constant feeling of being inadequate, and there was all kinds of little examples that came along that were probably quite insignificant. Like, one that kept creeping up, like there was the obvious ones, like you're a shit cyclist, you're a terrible person, and all this kind of stuff. But there was other ones like you're a terrible brother. And a lot of these thoughts went back to this childhood event where I was at a beach in Holland with my brother in the summer holidays. And I did kind of like lifeguarding as a kid, as a hobby. It was called like rookies or something like that. And we got swept out in the ocean. And I was like, don't worry, I'll get you back into shore. But I couldn't. And we had to get saved. And, you know, big panic. My brother ingested quite a bit of water and stuff like that. And even just little bits like that. That was something that happened like 15 years ago. And what it was doing was enforcing the narrative that I was worthless and that the world would be better off without me, to put it bluntly.
Did you ever have that conversation with your brother before you retired from racing?
No, because I didn't think it was relevant. It was something that happened so long ago that it was just a stupid, childish mistake, and we moved on. And I remember when I started getting help, I was getting myself tied in knots when I was speaking to, finally, when I found a psychiatrist that really clicked with me. And his solution was like really simple. He's like, you know, pretty much as you've said, he said, well, you know, I was saying I'm a terrible brother because of this and that and all this kind of stuff. And he's like, well, have you asked your brother what he wants from you? And then I was like, no. And then it was almost like this kind of like light bulb moment. It's like, why continually beat yourself up about something that's happened in the past instead of realizing it's happened and then trying to be the best brother you could be from that point? Because I wasn't being the best brother I could be. I was in this horrible cycle of self-wallow that I couldn't break out of, and that was what was inhibiting me in getting better.
Where was your brother when you won the gold medal, Callum? Where was he?
He was in the stands at Rio, and like Rio was a funny one. I'd say when I was pretty unwell, I wished I'd wished I hadn't won anything, so I could just default back to distraction mode. But the further that I continue along this path of recovery, the more I'm starting to get really proud of that achievement, and proud that my brother was there and my dad was there with, you know, and this is a guy I didn't invite to many events, as mentioned earlier, and my mum was there. And you know, it's still quite raw for a lot of the family because they've supported me massively, but I am at a point now where I'm immensely proud of what I achieved, and I'm glad that my family was there for it too.
I didn't know the answer to that question, but something inside me guessed he might have been there, and I guess it was as a proud a moment for him as it was for anybody. You know, it's great to hear that. And Callum, now time has just gone too quick. I could talk to you for ages. This is just, I think this is one of those really important interviews because, particularly for young people, because I think a lot of young people see people who win things and superstars, elite athletes, footballers, and we all assume that the world's just wonderful for you and everything's rosy and there are no issues. But you've highlighted a life of issues, which are probably, you know, that many people just go through because you're just as human as the next person. Where are you now then with your mental health? You say you're still getting help with it and things, is that right?
Yeah, and just what you're saying about successful people as well, that if you do get to that point of achieving whatever your goal was, and you know, having money and everything you wanted or whatever, it's such a place where you can end up being trapped as well, because you kind of think, what right have I got to be upset? You know, there's people on the streets, there's people who are having a far worse time than me. Like, get a grip of yourself. So it can be a bit of a horrible trap you end up in. But where I am now is actually a really good place. I think possibly one of the best things that I worked on with Steve was about, and this is maybe where religion comes into it a little bit, was establishing a value set. And I came up with these myself. And once you've established that value set about what makes you who you are, all of a sudden, like, elements like what you've achieved or what you've got in the driveway, or, you know, anything like that just doesn't matter, because you don't introduce yourself as like Callum, the Olympic gold medalist. If you would introduce yourself as like, I'm Callum, I'm very loyal to my friends and family, I'll do whatever I can for them, I'm very honest, you know, and all these different characteristics that make you who you are. And that's something that can't be impeded by your work performance or anything else that's going on in your life, because they're core to who you are. And for me, especially in terms of like tidying up my behavior, because I fell into a lot of bad habits as another form of distraction, is that you can see it coming, because you're like, I know this goes against my value set, so I'm probably going to feel pretty bad afterwards. and then you know where that cycle's coming from. You can start to break it. And it's probably one of the best recommendations that I've got for like therapy or help or of any kind.
Yeah.
It just gives you this heightened like awareness, and you get so much empowerment eventually. And I know this isn't the case for anyone, but definitely in my case, I got so much empowerment from realizing that it was a choice to continue feeling how I was. And I knew that if I kept working at it, stayed on the correct medication, you know, kept building my support network, that I was going to get better. And I started to see light. And if anything, I've continued down that path, and it's been amazing. I feel like I'm a much better person for it. And my mum actually said quite recently, or no, maybe a couple months ago, that she feels like she's getting the Callum back that she had before cycling. And that's kind of tragic, but also really nice to hear.
Yeah, I want to ask you. I see. Sounds ridiculous when I say parallels between myself and you, and you know, I was never ever going to win a gold medal, but I managed to get a degree a few years ago, which I never thought was something I would do, and it's only now that I'm beginning to value that and take a bit of self-pride. I've got a story that's not for this place. This is about you, but I want to ask you a question about when I guess you've got your gold medal there somewhere, maybe in a drawer or somewhere, and those moments where when you just catches the eye. I've got my picture up there, and sometimes I just think, wow, look at that. How do you feel about that? And are you able to really embrace that now as a wonderful thing?
I think that will come over time. For me, it still has a slight association with work, because you have to, at any kind of events you go to, you have to bring it out and then kind of go through the same association all over again. I really love kind of showing it off to kids and stuff like that, because I never saw an Olympic gold medal, and I firmly believe that if you are an Olympic medalist of any kind, that you should try and share that story as much as possible, because I was inspired by Chris Hoy, and I'd love to do the same for someone else. But personally, when I look at it now, yeah, I am proud of it. I'm really proud of it, and it doesn't happen too often, but I will catch myself in similar moments, like you said, where you just kind of look at it and think it was a good time.
Callum, I've just loved this interview. It's one of my very favourites because it's so real and true. And you're not far away from. I'm in Burnley. You're not far away. I'd love you to come to our kids' school with your gold medal and show it off to our kids sometime. That'd be. I'll buy you a Greg's meal deal or something as a box.
I can eat them now. I'm a big fan.
But it's been absolutely fantastic, and I think people are going to watch this, and I think they're going to be humbled and realise that we're all are just human beings, and we've got our own proverbial going on, and we all deal with it in different ways. But Callum, I really appreciate your time, and I send you all our best from Burnley, and thanks for coming on the Godcast.
Thank you very much. I look forward to visiting and picking up my meal deal.
See ya.
Cheers.